little waters.
Yeah, so nice.
And there's an organ in this building. They should have started with that.
Maybe I'll try to. Hello? Is it on? Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just stand for this part. It's wonderful to see many of you. I would encourage all of you, if you'd like to come up a little closer. We're all friends here. We do also have many folks joining us on Zoom or live stream to YouTube, so I want to welcome those folks as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Angelina Godoy, and I'm the director of the University of Washington Center for Human Rights, and we're really delighted to welcome you here. We try to have events like this every year, but this one is particularly special for, at least for me, because as you may know, our mission at the Center for Human Rights is to conduct research and put it at the service of real world social change led by people on the front lines of the struggles for human rights. And I know that many of you in the audience are precisely those people on the front lines of the struggles for human rights. And so I'm grateful to be in conversation with you today and in community here. And I'm also really excited to be here with such esteemed panelists because what we want to do is learn from all of you. Too often we engage with things from a research, well, not too often, that's our whole mission, but we engage with things from a research point of view. But as I was explaining to somebody just a moment ago in the reception, the whole purpose of that is to hopefully deliver tools that are useful to folks on the front lines. So what I hope we can do today is have a conversation about precisely that. What are we seeing out in our communities in Washington and Oregon in particular? And how can we collectively respond to the needs that are emergent right now? So I'm really excited to learn from our panelists about that. And I think toward that end, we're going to try to have as informal and free-flowing a discussion as possible. I've got some questions. We can have a discussion about those, and I hope we'll have time at the end that perhaps some of you in the audience can also pose questions. But just to get us started, I thought I would begin by asking all of you to just introduce yourselves, if you'd be so kind.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Montes. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Washington.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Walker-Keller, and I am with the Portland Immigrant Rights Coalition, PIRC.
Hello, I am David Morales, and I am with the Yakima Immigrant Response Network.
My name is Stephen Manning, and I am a lawyer from Oregon. And as of just a couple hours ago, I got sworn into the Washington State Bar, so I'm now a lawyer in Washington. I was the oldest person taking the oath today, so but it's really great to be here with everybody.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. I'd like to, as we get into the discussion, just situate a little bit in what's. Okay, thank you. So just to situate our discussion before we get into some of the details of how to respond in what we know, what's happening, and specifically what does the data show us about immigration enforcement trends in Washington and Oregon in recent months. So what you will see, and what perhaps confirms, sadly, many of our experiences, is that enforcement by ICE and the Border Patrol in the Pacific Northwest, enforcement in the form of arrests, has surged precipitously over the course of 2025 to such a point that it actually surpassed the historical high point of 2012 under the Obama administration. So we're talking about levels of enforcement that are literally unprecedented. And if we look more closely at what that data captures, you'll see that the means by which people are getting apprehended has also shifted in important ways. Much a higher proportion we're seeing now of street arrests, or if you want to use ICE's terminology, and that's where we're deriving this data from, it's non-custodial arrests. That's people that are not in the custody of another institution at the time of their arrest. Now, I'm probably telling you something, or I'm probably not, rather, telling you anything that you don't already know. All too many of us have seen experienced or heard about these arrests, or we've seen the kind of abandoned vehicles on the side of the road. We've seen our social media feed cluster with disturbing videos of people being pulled out of their cars, often accompanied by acts of violence, sometimes in the presence of children, often in warrantless arrests, in ways that we really hadn't seen as a systematic practice in Washington or Oregon, for that matter, in a systematic way until recently. And this is happening in both Oregon and Washington. But there are also some important differences within our region. If we look at differences between Oregon and Washington, for example, as states, you'll see there's been a steady increase over the course of 2025, a steady increase in Washington level of arrests. And that contrasts with a really dramatic spike in Oregon towards the end of 2025, which, as many know, it coincides with the arrival of federal forces into the Portland area in an operation that had various names, but among them was Operation Black Rose. So I want to maybe start with that really intense spike in arrests. And I want to ask those of you who have been working in Oregon in particular to help us understand what you've been experiencing, both during the height of that and then now, and also to tell us what we can learn from that. I think we in Washington and everyone really can learn a lot from the efforts that you all are engaged in, both in the courts and on the streets, to protect your neighbors. So I have a few questions. For example, I've found a lot of inspiration, to be honest, in some of the efforts that are coming out of Oregon in the courts and in the streets alike. I was really encouraged by Innovation Law Lab's work challenging the practice of warrantless arrests and securing an injunction actually barring that practice. And of course, the grassroots work, nothing short of heroic, I would say. And just in the last few days, we've also seen a new lawsuit brought by the Rural Organizing Project in Oregon, supported by the Oregon Law Lab, where they are challenging the practice of sharing vehicle registration data with the feds and its use for these very arrests that we're speaking about. They know that that's happening precisely because during Innovation Law Lab's initial work in the courts, they had officers testify and talk about precisely how they were doing that. So that's hugely important. I think all of us in the room have a lot to learn from you. And I'd like to ask, sorry, I keep saying I'd like to ask, but now I'm actually getting to my question. If you could speak to that, for example, how things have changed or not changed, perhaps since the data that we're talking about, since this spike. Both, I would assume, obviously, that as federal officers were forced to retreat from Oregon, that you'd see a quantitative diminishment in the level of arrests, but also I'm curious if, for example, the injunction against warrantless arrests has led to different, qualitative shifts in the way things are happening on the ground. So I'm going to turn the mic to you first, Alyssa. If you want to take this one, that one, whatever's best.
Very easy. Let's try this guy. Thank you. Yeah, I think a couple things. I was trying to jot down some thoughts of the important notes to hit. And I think maybe the stories, we've been tracking the data because that is part of our role in the ecosystem for the hotline since last June when we first had capacity to do so. And so we saw 1,067 people's loved ones call us to tell us that their loved one had been detained from June to December of last year. But about 900 of those were October to December. So the intensity of that is almost impossible to describe. Our organization was historically a grassroots just coalition of organizations. Currently, we are a nonprofit within a larger coalition, the Oregon for All Coalition. And to see just the intensity of the experience of trying to figure out how to navigate all that and the majority of our dispatchers who answer those hotline calls are volunteers. And so I think maybe the first human story that goes with the data that I'd want to share is the first dispatcher meeting we had after the surge began that we were experiencing, and just the brokenness of the people who had been holding those calls, who'd been holding people through that trauma. I will never forget. it was just tears across the screen. Just everyone just like, this is the thing we were preparing for and it's happening. And a sense of like, okay, all we can do is keep gathering the data and the stories, and we will help hold accountability, but we're going to have to hold through this first. And then it became like a process of like adjusting to that. And so some of our partners on the ground were doing incredible work, you know, to do mutual aid work, to set up patrols, to think of like next steps. Our legal partners, I don't think, slept for multiple months straight. And through that, we started to like catch little bits of like the data that were telling what was happening. It was warrantless, it was violent, it was broken glass across our counties and broken bones, and maybe most importantly, broken families. Because when you hear stories of people who are so concerned about their loved one because they got broken glass in their eyes during the detention and there was no medical care, you know, like those family members are distraught about what's happening to their loved ones and don't know what has happened. And then as that happened, we started to, you know, see a change in the tactics. We'd never experienced the degree of violent tactics that we went through. And then we ended up seeing January come and the numbers started dropping. And we attributed that to Minneapolis and then the incredible work that Law Lab put in to stop the warrantless arrests. Really just, we went from like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of detentions happening in a month. Our phones had been ringing off the hook. We were getting 5,000 phone calls in November to a hotline that's staffed by volunteers. And then suddenly it dropped to like 70 something people. And in February, it was 15 or 16 people who were reported to the hotline. So really sudden, dramatic drop. And then we started to see the thing we had known what was coming, which is the long-term trauma. Because then you started seeing the impacts of a breadwinner being taken and people not having a plan for how they were going to pay rent. Our eviction levels are going up. Our families are on the streets. Our counties are not prepared to deal with the number of people who can't pay for housing and sheltering. And then we started seeing the mental health trauma as well. We started seeing people who were getting out on bond at last and were afraid to leave their homes. We're afraid to walk out of their houses. We're afraid to go to the grocery store. We're afraid to literally do anything. And so that residual trauma is still staying in our community. And we're just trying at this point to like capture, again, what would have been helpful in that moment for these families. Maybe it's like better, you know, like making sure that we're talking about do not sign anything until you've talked to the folks at ECHO or, you know, your attorney. Do not sign. Like, how are we planning to prepare for the long haul is kind of where we're at right now, because this is a slowdown, but it doesn't mean that the long-term impacts have changed. And maybe I'll pass to Stephen to share like legally what that looked like for you all.
Thanks for sharing that, Alyssa. And thank you for this wonderful data. Like the power of data, I take this out. And maybe we'll talk about this later, is just how incredibly helpful it is in telling stories through a legal lens in court, but also here in community. And I want to riff on this for just a second and come back to some things that Alyssa said, and then I'm going to actually answer the question. So Oregon there's more people in the Seattle-Tacoma region than there are in the entire state of Oregon. And I mention that only to put these numbers to give some context. So when 2,000 people are disappeared from the streets of Oregon, Portland and the Portland metro area, that is, I mean, 2,000 people disappearing anywhere, do not get me wrong. That's like, it's bad, right? But it's also this huge shock wave, right? And when we look at this, so January 2025, right, we can begin to see like some change. So there's high numbers, and then there's like the sort of normalization of numbers. The Trump administration, the Trump regime was not getting what it wanted. And it really, we saw in Trump 1, this thing, what I would call constitutionally risky experimentation. So like, here's this concept, let's see what kind of risk we can take, see what we can do to push constitutional law. What I think we have seen in this regime is autocratic experimentation. And frequently that experimentation takes place first in the immigration space, because we talk about the dual state, sort of like Stranger Things, like the space between the upside down world and the right side world in immigration law is so thin. And so we see, okay, so there's maybe this normalization. In June 2025, you see that spike, July 2025, that's when they announced quotas. 30,000 people, we need those people. We need the bodies to feed this machine. So get those bodies forming. So we see that spike. And then September 28th, for whatever reason, the Trump regime picks a fight with Oregon, says, look, I don't care about these chicken people. I'm going to go in and I want the National Guard on the street. We're going to take over this state, this war-ravaged place. So that begins, September 28th, that's when it begins, Operation Black Rose. Now, and I'm going to come, and we see the spike. But I want to go back to actually that spike there in June and July, right there in that month, because it actually, Operation Black Rose, this thing that became, I don't want to say the culmination, I'm not sure what another word is, like the next stage in the progression of this autocratic experimentation, started in June. We saw in Oregon, we were watching what was happening in Los Angeles and New York and Chicago, people who were completely compliant with the law, following the law to a T, going to their immigration court hearings, because that's what they're supposed to do, being arrested at court, which is totally crazy, right? It's totally crazy. And we didn't understand, like, the phenomena of you're complying with the law, so therefore you're going to get detained and deported is such like, it's hard to understand how to contextualize that. But that started happening. So June 4th, in Oregon was the first immigration courthouse arrest. And that was, they arrested a trans woman named OJM. Those are her initials. She showed up, she had been, every step of her case was fully in compliance with the law. She came to the US border to apply for asylum, which is the only place you can do so, that's following the law. She followed every rule and regulation to a T, which is something I have a hard time doing. She goes to court because there had been, we had been waiting for this, right? Sadly, but we were ready. And there was an amazing, sorry, I'm going to probably cry about this. There was this amazing community response, this amazing set of legal observers from the community who were stationed at the court, who are watching at the court, who are watching outside the court, who are creating these corridors of safety and observance, so that we, the lawyers, we knew who was on the docket, right? Because in Oregon, we have a universal representation system. So everybody who's, like, the government's trying to deport, they get access to a lawyer in Oregon. And so we have this system, and so we knew who was going to be on the docket that day. And so we knew OJM was at risk. And by golly, they took her. And as soon as they took her, we had video evidence of her being taken, like whisked down this back stair. We were within probably about 3 hours, because of this overwhelming community response, the lawyers were able to get on file a lawsuit, a petition for habeas corpus, which we did again the next day, and we did for every single person that they arrested at the immigration court. And then they stopped. And they have not arrested a single person at the Portland Immigration Court since July. And you see that reflected in the numbers, right? So you see that. And then comes Operation Black Rose. And I'm going to stop in 1 second. And then you see, I hear this, give the mic to a lawyer, and you're like, oh God, we're screwed now. And so then Operation Black Rose, what we see here is, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later, but there used to be this, like this, we talk about before, like in Trump 1 and secure communities, the phenomenon of the disappeared, right? Like someone went to work, they got stopped by the police, and then they vanished. And next thing you know, they've been deported because they were like taken secretly, opaquely. But during Operation Black Rose, what we saw is they experimented a bit, right, with like law compliance. Then they needed to actually do something different. So, okay, we had all these National Guard that were in Portland. They got paused. They could not put them on the streets. They were deployed, but they could not be sent on the streets. And so the regime said, you know what? We've got 500 to 600 CBP officers there, Border Patrol. Let's do something with them. What kind of havoc can we create in this autocratic experimentation? So they sent them out on the streets with using technology and violence. And about 2,000 individuals were taken. There was probably not a single incident of lawful conduct by any ICE officer, any DHS officer in that 2.5-month period prior to getting the injunction. We filed so October 30th. I'm winding down here. October 30th, Woodburn, Oregon, in the morning, there was this woman, a farm worker, going out to the field. So Woodburn's just south of Portland. She was going out to the fields. She was putting together Christmas wreaths. Christmas trees are a big deal in Oregon, probably here, I think, in Washington too. So putting together Christmas wreaths, and she was in a van. Now, there were 12 ICE officers that testified under oath that they couldn't figure out why at 5:30 in the morning, people were getting into a van and driving together out into the fields. They assumed, they're like, why would anyone get into a van to go anywhere at 5:30? They assumed it couldn't have been like a carpooling, a car van. But in their minds, what they said is like, oh, this is what they testified to. This must be human trafficking. These people are victims of human trafficking. This is what they testified to under oath. So they stopped the van. Within 30 seconds of stopping the van, they didn't know a single individual inside that van. They shattered the window, opened up the van, and then proceeded to arrest every single person. These, quote, victims of human trafficking quickly became the victims of this ICE scheme of lawlessness. And the first person that they arrested, her name was MJMA, those are her initials. We got a lawsuit on file for her, a petition for habeas corpus, using the same sort of community response network. So within minutes of the ICE arrest, the people inside that van, they were making phone calls to the hotline, to their family members, to others, and we got alerted so that we could then deploy lawyers to be ready to get on file. So we were there and we were on file within 9 minutes, which was great because we only had 2 minutes to spare. Before, ICE would have taken her across the Oregon-Washington border in sort of this fleeing from the courts in Oregon. That case became the case which we then used to amend to create a class action. And February 4th, the judge issued an injunction saying, stop the warrantless arrests. And since then, there were 4 in February, 2 in March, and there was 1 in April.
Thank you. Thank you. That's incredible. I mean, I'm so grateful to be here with you and to learn from you. I want to shift the frame a little bit to the challenges we're facing here in Washington. While, of course, as this data shows, right, we haven't seen, an invasion of federal forces. We haven't seen a surge like what we're hearing about from folks in the Portland area. Although some of those tactics definitely did spill over into arrests happening in Southwest Washington. On the whole, we've been spared that so far, but we do see really dramatic levels of enforcement. We have seen in areas like Yakima, as you see here, and all the more so when you take into account population for the same reason that Stephen is speaking to. So I'd like to ask you, David Morales, if you could speak to that a little bit. Looking back over the past year, how have things changed on the ground in Yakima?
Quite a bit. On average, about once a week, we see something a little bit different than the week before. And this morning, we saw all kinds of things that were a little bit new. And so trying to wrap our heads around it has always been difficult because they have moved on to a different tactic. And I don't know what's going on. Honestly, my impression is that there's a level of experimentation to figure out what they could get away with, what it's expeditious. There's an entrepreneurial aspect to it, that they're capable of inventing methods and then trying to execute those methods. And sometimes those methods blow up in their face and they just arrest a bunch of Latino people or stop a bunch of Latino people who are US citizens or legal permanent residents, and they have no reason to be stopping those people, and they're just wasting their own time and everybody's time. But by doing different tactics over and over and over again, they're able to hone in on things that are very efficient for them. And then they focus on doubling down on those efficient things. And so we saw a bunch of experimentation in 2025. And now this year, they're really just focused on the things that really pay off. And what pays off for them, it's calling people into the ISAP office, which is a program to monitor individuals who have asylum claims or other kinds of immigration. It's kind of like a Bell situation. And so these people have to go into the office ever so often and then be rescheduled. Well, now a large portion of those people will be arrested when they're called into the ISAP office. Another example of this is using the Yakima jails, because in the Yakima jails, it's a bit of a cattle call. They just call up like 20 people at 1 o'clock, and they know this person's first and last name. This person has identified themselves to the court. They have stationed an ICE officer in the Yakima Municipal Court to basically just text the ICE officers outside. And the second the person walks out, they're going to be arrested. And so this has been happening in the municipal court, and a version of it has been happening in the Superior Court for much of the last year and a half. We're also seeing more use of license plate readers, and the license plate readers being used to identify people who are undocumented. And we kind of think that this has to do with their ability to see that someone doesn't have a social security number in terms of their registration for their automobile, because all these things are linked at the back end. So that's been a very useful tactic to them. But they make mistakes, and I'm hoping that we're going to be better able to identify the mistakes, and through the help of organizations like the ACLU, be able to stop some of these tactics. But it's been difficult to keep up with it. Just to give you guys some context, Yakima Immigrant Response Network is a group of about 140 volunteers. It's a group that does rapid response, which is the one that I lead. There is a group that does humanitarian response, which is something closer to social work. There's a group that does accompaniment. There's a group that does the community response center, which focuses on large-scale raids. There's a group that does medical systems, another group that does education, and another group that does religious organizing. And so it's just the power of volunteers to try to make things happen. And the group that I specifically work with is the Rapid Response Group. And so we receive information about things going on in the community, and our response times have gone down. So right around December, our response times were about 5 to 10 minutes. But somewhat unfortunately, their response times have gone down too. And so even though when we go out there and we put on our vest and we set up a camera and we start filming them, they will leave the scene immediately because they don't want to deal with civilians. We're only able to do that about 1 out of 25 times. Most of the time, they're operating so fast that by the time we get there, by the time anybody else gets there, the situation has already gone and the person is in ICE custody, and the humanitarian team has to take over at that point. So they've been getting much faster over time.
Thank you. David Montes, I'd like to ask you if you could speak a little bit as David Morales, sorry, you have very similar names. As he spoke to the ACLU is really at the forefront of thinking about what are strategies that could work here in Washington from a legal line. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think one thing that you've heard a lot is how many resources went into building up the enforcement mechanisms. They absolutely did not match those resources with taking care of the people that they had arrested. So one of the things, just in terms of what we have seen, is unbelievable conditions in the Northwest Detention Center and all around our state. And so we've been engaging with a lot of people who are reporting not getting medication, illnesses sweeping through the facilities, those sorts of things. But sort of like bringing, like telling a story of a human being that was affected. We actually found out from UW Center for Human Rights about a woman who had been detained at the northern border. Basically, she was seeking asylum in the United States with her family. It was her husband, a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old, 5-year-old, and 11-month-old. And they were seeking asylum in the United States because of a lot of the fear that was going around from the Trump administration. They were like, we're going to get out of here. We're going to go to Canada. And they were going to seek asylum in Canada. But Canada has a safe third country agreement with the United States, and so they turned them back. ICE was absolutely not equipped to handle this situation. And so a family of 6 was kept in a side cell at the Blaine facility for 28 days. So, I mean, we now represent them. The mother's name is Josephina. Josephina said that her 13-year-old son could lay and touch the walls in both directions, which probably means it was like a 7-by-7 cell. The only running water in the cell was the toilet. And so Josephina was pregnant at this time, and to like clean themselves, they were not given shower facilities, but maybe once a week, they were using the toilet water. And everything they ate came out of a microwave. Josephina had a high-risk pregnancy and was being taken to the hospital, but about half as much as she should have been. They were ultimately released from ICE custody. I've still not had any explanation as to why they were taken into ICE custody. They were out on bond. They sought asylum in a different country, but they didn't violate their bond in any way. So they were eventually released, and they're doing well. Their asylum cases is going forward. But I think in terms of like the real human cost that goes into just this mass enforcement with either no foresight or just not caring very much, you know, I think that story really illustrates the human cost that has gone into it. And that's one family. We represent that family, and we're very happy to be trying to do something for them. But for, you know, that story, there's tens of thousands across the country of people who are facing similarly horrific conditions. And the standards are so low that, you know, it's really hard to quantify that human toll in addition to the toll on the families on the outside and all of those things. So I think that's one thing that has really come from all of this and that we have to deal with and figure out how to address.
Thank you. It's really almost impossible to reckon with the depth and scale of the human suffering that you're all speaking to in different ways. And then to wrap, at least for me, my mind around the fact that we're talking about our neighbors, we're talking about our state and our neighbor state, we're talking about our communities. And yet too often when I hear our own, too often when I hear, I was going to say our own elected officials, but I don't think it's limited to them. They're talking about what's happening in Minneapolis as if it's something we have thus far been spared. Now, I don't want to suggest that we're experiencing anything near the scale of the horror that Minneapolis saw at the beginning of this calendar year, but I don't think we could take away any other message from the stories we are hearing than recognizing that horror is here. It has been here. It is still here. And that's a really important thing for us to grapple with as a community or a set of communities. So one of the things I often hear people, and it does happen to be often elected officials, or I would say the officials of this university will say the same thing. People often in positions of power will say, well, the feds haven't targeted us yet, so we better, we have been spared in some way that fate. And the idea being that the sort of massive ramp up or invasion of forces from out of state that we saw in Minnesota, or before then in Chicago and LA, but we also heard about in Portland, that's the thing to be feared. Now we have new leadership at DHS, and they say that they're trying to do enforcement in a quote unquote quieter way, but they made it clear that they're not intending to do any less enforcement. And I don't know if it's just my social media algorithm or my friends or contacts or whatever, but it certainly seems to me that even just in the last couple weeks, things are starting again to heat up, not only here, but elsewhere as well. So this is really a question for the whole panel. I'm wondering whether in fearing the federal invasion, are we missing ways that we need to be prepared for something different, something they may call quieter, but that is no less brutal? And any thoughts you might want to share about that? And anyone?
I have a few thoughts here. We had a version of this. We saw a raid, large-scale farm worker raid in Mount Baker, Washington. And this made us think, everyone in Yakima, hey, they're going to target the agriculture industry. And about half the town works in packing sheds. So when you say, oh, Yakima is mostly agricultural workers, Yakima is mostly agricultural workers who work in packing houses, which are big concrete structures where it is very easy to trap them inside. Some of these things have 1,500 people in one building. And there are 30,000 undocumented people who live in Yakima County. So it's pretty easy to figure out what we think they're probably going to do next. And we prepared for a large-scale raid and spent all of our time thinking about this is going to come, this is going to come, this is going to come, and sort of ignored, honestly, we were kind of ignoring, but not entirely, but like our creative efforts were all focused on the raid. But we didn't realize how many people were being taken on an individual basis with the ISAP office, with the municipal court, with all the individual arrests going on. And that has really ramped up again. And they really don't need, if we imagine the top of their enforcement capacity being the amount of people they could fit into the Northwest Detention Center, they don't need to do anything large scale to fill up the Northwest Detention Center. They could fully fill it up with all of the mechanisms that they have right now, firing on all cylinders. And so it requires us to be thinking much broader and not just be thinking, okay, this big scale thing is going to happen. Now, we are preparing because we have heard that one of the larger packing houses did get an I-9 audit, and an I-9 audit tends to precede a raid. So we are watching that, but we're also spending a lot more time focusing on all the individual arrests and making sure that everyone is receiving help, and that we're trying to stand up for people's rights in those situations as well.
I think one thing that it's just important to keep in context with is that you see what happened in Los Angeles, you see what happened in Portland, in Chicago, and what happened in North Carolina was crazy. And it moves the goalposts a little bit. You sort of say like, oh, that's the really bad thing. But in any other context, what is happening in Washington right now, when you look at the spike in arrests, would be considered an insane and historic overreach. I mean, the idea that people would just have their license plates read and then be pulled over and just arrested on the streets with no warrant, ICE actually has additional legal requirements that is somewhat the basis of the case from the Innovation Law Lab. So all of that is to say, I think the idea, you said this, the idea that, it hasn't hit us yet, only by comparison has it not hit us yet. But, and we at the ACLU are thinking of ways to challenge it. It is harder. In addition to being unbelievably inhumane, it's also really stupid the way they did it in Los Angeles and Chicago and Minnesota, because it's so visible, and in Portland too. It's actually much more insidious to be doing it in the quote unquote quieter way, where they're targeted, they go and pick someone off the street, and you maybe find the car on the side of the road and you have very little information about what you're doing. But, fortunately, we have partners like UWCHR who is tracking this stuff, right? Because when you're trying to illustrate to a judge a pattern, you need to have the anecdotal cases. You need to have the people who had the van of their van window busted out and 13 people arrested when they didn't know who they were. But you also need to show this broader pattern. And that's where this data is so important to illustrating the broader pattern. If you're going to bring one of these challenges in a context of sort of quieter enforcement, and then of course having people like David Morales on the ground watching these things and telling us what's happening. So I think one of the reasons that we shouldn't accept this narrative that it hasn't happened to us is it's actually much more insidious the way that they're doing it, much harder to challenge, and more important that people sort of find ways to do that.
Can I riff on that for a second? Because the slide before, your data shows it is happening, right? It actually, because the way I understand the question is like, don't poke the bear, don't provoke the bear, because or whatever, the bears are actually very nice. Like, don't poke this Trump thing, because then you don't know what's going to happen, or you don't want to but I don't think that's, I think that misstates, when that thinking misstates the nature of experimentation. That in the way that you just described it is, David, that it's actually happening here, like this quieter, that's their term. That's not true. That's that you see the numbers there, that as they're building the apparatus of mass incarceration, they are continuing to build these pathways to stigmatization. And then they're eliminating courts and lawyers, which are the three things that they need to achieve mass deportation. So it's already happening here, and I think that's what both of you just described, and that's what your numbers say. And there's either the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment exists everywhere at all the time, or it doesn't, and that's kind of just where it's going to go.
As you were talking, I was remembering something one of our legal observers told us from the days when ICE was in immigration court, and they were spending a lot of time, these agents, chatting amongst themselves in a freight elevator, assuming that nobody could hear anything they were saying. But if you've ever stood outside like a closed door, obviously you can hear what's being said. And they were saying, one of the agents was saying to the other, we know all the rules. And so we're just we're going to come up as close as we can, or we're going to break, I can't remember exactly the phrasing, but it was we're going to the letter of the law, can be bent in a billion different ways. And that was how they were thinking about it. And I think as they're thinking about all this experimentation, as they're thinking about all these different ways that they can test or try or break, but quietly, this is a really important moment for us to be thinking about how this narrative of that, poking ICE is, or, poking and pushing back is going to draw attention. it's really important to remember that correlation is not causation. And I just feel like I repeat that all the time in meetings that we're with, when we're with electeds or when our partner organizations are thinking about policies. This is not the moment to comply in advance. And this is the moment for us to be building up our strength in patterns of resistance and that muscle memory of no, actually, no, you don't get to do that in our community. You don't get to say that in our community. And I think our electeds, sometimes in this moment, all of us feel powerless, and we get to remind them that they have all of us behind them and that we're with them. And also, if they are not able to move those ways, we get to remind them that we'll make other choices, right? And so it's a moment for us to be thinking together about what are our targets, because they clearly are targeting specific people. So what are our targets? Is it billionaires? Is it the for-profit, industrial prison complex? Is it the organizations, the hotels, the cars, rental places that are renting to ICE? And then to organize around that, to be thinking about how are we pushing back? How are we taking, if they're going to target people, then we're going to target the systems that make it so they can take those people.
Thank you. So if we can switch gears a little bit, but not too much, because this is already a topic several of us have spoken to. One of the things some of you may know that our center has been doing research on in the past year is surveillance and different surveillance tactics, and particularly how those intersect or could intersect with immigration enforcement. And speaking personally, one of the reasons I've been most interested in understanding those tactics is to try to understand the ways that local governments may be empowering or permitting or facilitating the use of surveillance technologies that then ICE uses to hunt us, right? So we spoke already about license plate readers and stuff like that. Because on the one hand, it's, a tall order to stop ICE at the border of our states. That's impossible. It's also a tall order to immediately stop all of those invasive surveillance technologies. But we do have laws on the books that limit what our local government should be doing with our data. And perhaps that's one area where local pressure in regions like ours can be effective in curtailing, at least, ICE's access and Border Patrol's access to information that only is available through state or local agencies. So motor vehicle data is a good example of that. There's one sole repository of that information, and that is the Department of Licensing in the state of Washington. So some of the research that we've done recently has been looking at ways that both Oregon and Washington laws prevent state agencies from sharing motor vehicle and driver data with federal forces for purposes of civil immigration enforcement. And yet we know that's exactly what's happening. And this is different even than license plate readers. It's the accessing of the Department of Licensing database. When I have a car in front of me and I want to know who might be driving that car, if I'm ICE, I can query through here in Washington, through the Washington State Patrol, the database of the Department of Licensing and find out the name of the owner, registered owner of that car. I can then run that person's name through the proprietary databases they have access to, and within minutes I can pull them over. And that's what's powering the arrests that we are seeing, right? So in some ways, this is against the law, the state law that many of you in the audience here fought hard to pass in Washington, the Keep Washington Working Act, and in Oregon, the Sanctuary Promise Act. Activists fought really hard to pass both of those laws. And so my question, and this is again for everyone, are those laws not enforceable? Is this a question of political will? What can we do to curtail those practices? Should we continue to rush to pass, bills that ban wearing masks and then they continue to do it? Or should we devote our energies elsewhere? Thoughts?
The Yakima City Council was outraged when they found out that the Trump administration listed the city of Yakima as a sanctuary jurisdiction, because for them, they are helping the Trump administration. And they wanted to be very public and very clear. They are helping the Trump administration, and it is only because of the evil state laws that they cannot give all the information that ICE would like the city to be handing over. So we know, because they've been so public about it, that the political consensus in Yakima is to read all these laws as narrowly as humanly possible, comply with them only when necessary, and otherwise work very closely with immigration officials. No one is being coy or not out there about it. Like Amanda McKinney, the lead Republican candidate for the congressional office, like spent a lot of time talking about this. It's not a secret what's going on. But it's still surprising to sometimes see the brazenness in which, oh, we're going to let ICE do all these things because it's not technically inside the courthouse when these arrests are happening. They're happening in the parking lot and outside the court. And therefore, it's not a violation of the Keep Washington, the Courts Open to All Act. Or it's not a violation of the Keep Washington Working Act because they arrested this person for reentry after prior deport. Or they're arresting this person because they were using a fake social security number and it's technically a criminal law case. Therefore, the sheriff's office and the police department and the marshals and even the helicopter show up to arrest. And yet, 3 hours later, the U.S. attorney drops the case and the person is in immigration custody. It was always an immigration arrest from the very beginning. And they're kind of toying with the state of Washington, to be honest.
That's really powerful, and really glad you shared that. And to like extend it for a second, the Fourth Amendment, if you haven't read it lately, strongly encourage you to do so, because it's a really amazing and powerful amendment. The Supreme Court doesn't think so, but it actually is very, if you read it, the word particularly appears in that amendment. And that word appears in that amendment, and the amendment exists in large part because during the Revolutionary War, prior to the Revolutionary War, like one of the causes was what was called the writs of assistance. So the King George would write these writs saying, go find me people to arrest. Go find me the tax cheats. And it would be a writ, like this paper, this document that would pass out to an officer, and they would go searching, going in homes and searching. Let's search and find someone who broke the law so we can arrest them. And so they wrote the Fourth Amendment, and they put in the word particularly in the amendment, and it says that you have to have a writ or a warrant that particularly describes the people to be seized or arrested and the places to be searched. And what's happening with the technology is that Fourth Amendment is being bypassed. That particularity requirement is as if it didn't exist. And thinking about the power of the Fourth Amendment and how it has very much structured our society and our civic systems and the way we interact with our government, imagine a world without the Fourth Amendment. Because then you can end up with something, the target-rich environment here. So that's that came from MJMA's case, that they used license plates readers, and they were looking not for a person, but they literally were looking at an entire community, because that community was target-rich. And target-rich, so using license plates readers, and then tying it together with what they called, quote, an immigration nexus. Now, what's an immigration nexus? An immigration nexus is if you appear in any of the immigration databases, which is basically every database. If you've ever crossed the border, you appear in an immigration database. And so essentially everyone could be a part of a target-rich environment, depending how they wanted to find the targets. And so the Fourth Amendment goes away. And so all of those arrests that took place right? Using the license plates reader technology, tied it into the surveillance system. They have these apps called Immigration OS. It's so crazy. And this other app called Elite. I can't remember what it stands for now. But essentially, the way the agent described it, it's like Google Maps. It's Google Maps where the pins are people. And if there's a place with enough pins, you can throw a net and catch the people that you want, so you can get your 3,000 quota. And so the surveillance is part of the autocratic experimentation, and it won't stop here in the immigration space. And do the laws matter, but do they matter here when you can buy the information? So I mean, I don't know, like when you can buy the information on the market through the data brokering system, like I give up my ID and my licensing information to the state of Oregon so I can drive, and then they have my license information so I can drive and participate in civic society. And now that information is now monetized to bypass the Fourth Amendment. I mean, can we stop it? I don't know.
I mean, I think part of the answer is just obviously yes, we could do things, right? So UWCHR's report about NLITs got a lot of attention from the governor's office. The governor read that report and was very interested in it because he did not like the implication that they could do something about that. He said, because if we did something about that, then you couldn't use your Easy Pass at the northern border. So what they basically said was, okay, yes, we have to give some people access to the license plate readers from the federal government because CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, is going to scan your license plate when they're coming across the border. Of course, I'm sure Bob Ferguson knows this, but some people from ICE know some people from CBP. They're part of the same umbrella organization. And as it turns out, the great study that you all did shows that sure enough, CBP was accessing the NLIT system. And sure enough, they'd access the NLIT system and boy, we'd get a I-213 from ICE that said that they arrested someone right afterwards. And so, other states have taken more active steps to shutting it down. New York has shut down access to the NLIT system for these groups. And guess what? New Yorkers can still cross the border to Toronto. So I think there are things that can be done. I think also local jurisdictions in Washington have taken down their automated license plate readers. There's a big fight in Seattle right now about whether we are going to have automated license plate readers. Port Angeles banned automated license plate readers. So, there are steps that can be taken if people are willing to do those things. The other thing I want to say about sort of the interaction between Keep Washington Working and what our state is doing at a state level, it should be said that our AG has enforced Keep Washington Working. Me and Phil Neff, who's part of the center, are both on a Keep Washington Working board together, doing work to help them do that. And so they have done those things. They've also just refused to do other things that they could do. So, for example, people who are in Department of Corrections custody, they're still reporting those people to ICE. And we actually Washington State has taken a sort of radical position that if someone has an immigration detainer, they're not eligible for probation. So they're going to end up spending a lot more time in prison than people who don't have an immigration detainer. We just partnered on a brief to the Washington Supreme Court about this issue, arguing that that is unfair. But, again, Washington State doesn't have to do those things. We're sort of voluntarily, it would be illegal for them not to give information that they're asking for, but Washington State DOC is just giving a list of everyone that comes into their custody to ICE right now. And they don't have to do that. They don't even have to do that under Keep Washington Working, even though the prison is exempt from the non-reporting requirements. So, I don't know if that's ultimately going to work, to Stephen's point, but could. Right. And, I think what's at the edge of a lot of what Stephen has said tonight is, it starts in the immigration context and it broadens out from there. And it's not, not that it's not important to protect immigrants, but it's also, in all of our interests to think really hard about what kind of place we want to live in and how many of these tools are going to be turned on us ultimately.
And maybe just to build on everything that everyone up here has said already so eloquently, there's lots of different kinds of wins when we're in this moment. And I think sometimes a win is slowing it down and making it harder. So I guess to your point, like the steps could be taken. There are steps we can take if we want to take them. And so how do we make this deeply understood and widely felt enough for people to care and act, to ask for these meetings with their leaders, to research the issues, to like name the things, to teach enough non-compliance that there's enough of us who are like, we're not going to do the things. We're just going to stop. We're not going to share our data anymore. Maybe we're not going to, X, Y, or Z thing. Because like I said earlier, those agents are already thinking of like how to test the boundaries. And the way it's showing up in our data right now in the last couple of months is that we're seeing less arrests, yes, and a lot of testing boundaries, a lot of like reports of like weird drones in the sky or weird people getting out of cars and taking pictures of license plates in parking lots. And when someone asks, who are you and why are you doing that? They say, go back in your house with no explanation. And when we hear about where people are being picked up, they look an awful lot like violations of Sanctuary Promise Act, protections. And so it's our job right now, I think, to do the data and the meaning making and to be like, this is the moment. This is us explaining, this is what this is meaning for right now. And this is what this will lead to. And how are we telling the story of this is not the world that we want it to be. And so like the world as it is, the world as it should be, drawing that line so people see it.
Well, maybe I pick up on that for my last question, and then maybe if we have time, I'll turn over for others to ask questions, because I'm sort of holding two feelings simultaneously right now. One is just the heaviness of the horrors that we know we're facing, but that you all have expounded upon so eloquently in this space, and just listening to you a lot. Discouraging, but I also feel like such deep admiration and admiration for and inspired by the work that you all are doing. And I want to know how we can help you do it more. I selfishly want to know that in my own space as the director of the Center for Human Rights. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And of course, I think there's also calls to all of us as human beings to do more. But maybe we start from the research point of view. How can researchers, we're at a university, how can researchers help advance this work that you all are leading?
I think I've cited 4 different studies that we've relied on in doing the work that we're doing in a lot of different contexts already. So, tracking these things and doing the work you're doing, I think that's phenomenally good. And I think one of the things that, to sort of like go back to the setup in your question, one of the things that has given me hope is that everywhere where people have stood up, it has been an unbelievable nightmare for the administration. Los Angeles, Chicago, Portland, all those places, Minneapolis. The administration ultimately fled because what they found out is most Americans don't want this. Like most Americans are willing to say like, okay, yeah, like they're willing to other people, but if they see it on the TV, they're like, no, I didn't want that. People are willing to say, I didn't want that thing. And I think that comes from 2 places. One is people are willing to get out on the street and say, no, I don't accept this. And 2, shedding light on what's happening. So people are willing to see something wrong and pull out their phone and record it. So many of the things that have changed have come from brave people pulling out a phone and recording what was happening. And I think, getting the data, those charts, they look simple, but that what actually went into that is asking for a bunch of I-213s. I-213s are ICE police reports. having them say no, or having them say we're going to take forever, suing them, finally getting them to give some, and then going through one by one and inputting the data so that we have those charts. That sort of bringing light to the situation is really what we need. And that goes for everyone, right? That goes for everyone here. That goes for me. That goes for, when we can get information out to the public and show them the world that we want to live in, and that this is not the world that we want to live in, that is what has power, and that is what has changed things. And so, all the legal work is great, but I think it's one piece of the puzzle, and the piece of the puzzle that has actually made the biggest difference is people saying, I won't accept this, and shedding light on what's happening.
I think also your data tells stories of, it helps us compare against our data, because I'll be honest, like PERC's data is baby data compared to the data that you all are able to pull together. And partially that's because, we're very limited, small team capacity wise, but also, we're asking some questions and you're giving us ideas of things that we could be asking. And you're helping us think about how to frame it and tell a story with our data. And for instance, when you shared, the number of folks who had been detained in Multnomah County, that didn't match our numbers. Our Washington County numbers were close, but our Multnomah County numbers weren't. And that told us that Multnomah County is one of the most diverse counties in Oregon too. So that told us that we had work to do in language access. That told us that we had work to do in reaching other communities and building partnerships with new relationships, new trusts. So that was incredibly helpful data for us. And I think another way that the data could be helpful is helping us tell where the interventions mattered, because that helps us talk to people who make decisions to be hey, look at this important data around when legal funding happened, how many people were helped, when housing assistance dollars are on the line, targeted universalism, how are we helping the people who are most vulnerabilized in this moment, so that actually helps all of us out, because we actually think everybody deserves to have shelter right now. Everybody deserves to be indoors. Everybody deserves to have food right now. Some real basic things. And then the last place where I would love to two things. One, I would love to meet with you all regularly. I think that would be really helpful in terms of thinking about data and riffing off each other's work. And I would love help with researching the hope too, because if we're doing this meaning making and people are hearing the data that breaks our souls, we need to also tell stories about when things mattered, when the interventions happened, but the human stories of hope too. How many legal observers have actually made a difference? How many, mutual aid groups have actually been able to stand up funds that have made a difference in keeping people sheltered. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Many politicians are under the impression that they have solved the problem because they have passed a law that addresses things. And that's really only the first step, right? You got to implement it. You got to do all kinds of things to put the policies out there. You got to enforce it. Many of these laws have no enforcement mechanism, and they just discovered that 2 weeks ago, that there's nothing they could do about some of these violations. The fact is, not everyone is going to go with your agenda or with your policy idea if there is nothing that's going to implement the law, if there is no enforcement mechanism, if there is no one's job to make sure something actually gets done. And so it's a lesson for many people. And I think the work of this center in highlighting the gap between what the law says and what's actually happening, that's going to be very important going forward, to keep highlighting this gap, because they keep passing laws and they keep not implementing them. Passing more laws isn't the solution. And so it's a way of getting at the problem. I have found it remarkable that when we see things, a couple months later, it shows up in your data. And so it tells me, okay, I'm not crazy. They're doing this thing. It's, there's only like 3 gel cells at the ice station in Yakima. And so to be able to look at those gel cells with a decent amount of numerical fidelity is pretty useful. Same thing with the other forms of arrest. And so the data has been a really great tool to make sure that we're keeping that what we're seeing is matching what's happening, and that we're closing the gap, because there has always been a gap from the very beginning. We only had contact with maybe about 1 out of 10 people being deported. And then it was about 1 out of 5. Then it's about like 1 out of 3. Now it's about 1 out of 2. It might be even a majority at this point. But we're covering a bigger amount of the people who are being deported through the through the Yakima Immigrant Solidarity Network, with help from the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, and we're getting closer to a real match here, and so that's been just great to see. And so, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I'm going to jump on the love bomb here for the research. So I think like research is not that different from lawsuits in the sense that they're retrospective, that they're like, we go to court to sue about a problem that happened in the past to like get redress for that. And research is about things that have happened in the past and looking at that information. And the thing about the research that has been very powerful, that has been generated particularly by your institution, is the insights and the patterns that allow us to predict the future, or at least to prognosticate on what could be the possibilities. And so that's been very powerful. And so it provides that context, that framing that's necessary.
Thank you. It's a lot to chew on in these recommendations, and a lot to think more about. But certainly if you ask to meet more, we would love to meet more too. That's something we can definitely make happen. I'm not sure how we are doing on time, but yeah, so maybe we could take some questions from the audience. If anybody would like to pose a question from the audience, I see some hands up. I'll come out and bring the mic to you. You raised your hand first, so here you go.
Hi. Well, there's a lot of things that I'd want to say and ask, but just building on the last comments from the panel, how long do you think you're going to be able to continue to do this work in this institution without being attacked and threatened with losing your status or your funding, given that that's happened in this institution and others around this country, where state universities don't stand up to the administration any more than a lot of the legal institutions do? And what you're doing is exposing this administration for its violation of human rights and its violation of constitutional rights, and using that as a tool for people to fight back. Just to David's comment, this is not the world we want to live in, but it's the world that the people in power in this country want to live in. And they're doing everything they can to continue to make sure that happens, that they implement what they said they were going to do in Project 2025. It's all there, and they're implementing it every chapter and verse, knowing that most of it is against the Constitution, and they're just going to keep doing it while we continue to fight to try to make it stop. And we have to continue to do that. So my question is, what is your sense of your security? But then I also want to make sure that people are aware that in the middle of June, things could get worse around here, because FIFA's coming to town, the World Cup is coming to town, and ICE most likely is coming to town also. So just in that context, and are you going to be doing research during that period of time to see what the impact is of that presence?
Well, I guess this question primarily for me. The whole time you're speaking, I'm thinking of how do I answer this? I will say your question is very perceptive. We do feel the pressures of which you speak. We at the Center for Human Rights were created with a very specific mission. The state of Washington passed a law to bring us into being. And that mission was what I started out talking about tonight, which was to conduct research to inform the work done by frontlines advocates for human rights. That mission even calls out immigrant rights as a key area that our center is called to work on, mandated by state law to work on. So I believe that it is our obligation to continue to do that work. We have experienced reprisals for our work in the past. If they come again, we will fight them.
Hello, my name is Muna. I'm a student at the University of Washington, and my minor is actually in human rights. I work with a lot of nonprofits, especially in the East African community. I also serve on the board of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for the City of Seattle Commission. And I think that a question that heavily is heavy on my heart is between surveillance cameras and safety, public safety, especially in South Seattle. There's an argument for both sides, and I want to ensure that we're protecting our communities, our vulnerable communities, but then also ensuring that we're doing all that we can for justice in the name of justice. So I wanted to touch more on what are your thoughts on surveillance cameras and how we can support and protect the communities, but also ensure that we're seeking justice.
Which of the panelists are you directing your question to? And
this is always the question, right? Every single time, like anytime you talk about what you're going to give the government the power to do, Stephen was talking about like where this all came from. Okay, what they said was, look, we don't want the government just going into everybody's home and tracking everybody, right? I think so I'm not going to answer your question at all because I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's always the question, and it's always the question that we're going to be struggling with when we ask the question, how much power do we give the government to interfere with our lives? What I'll say is this: some of the systems that are being put together, especially with things like computer learning and the ability of computers now to like do facial recognition and automated license plate readers, you can put together unbelievably detailed maps of cities and track anyone anywhere in the city. And so, and you can say, okay, I want to find this license plate. Where has it been? Not just right now, not just what happened then, but I want to know where it's been at all times for the past 5 days, 7 days, all of those types of things. I think there are some relatively common sense ways to address those issues, some of those issues. Retention policies, right? Maybe you have a very short retention policy and it can only be observed if there is a warrant like you would get from a judge, right? So there's a shooting in the area, police go get a warrant, they can then look at the camera and see what was, right? You could have a warrant requirement for cameras. I think this is going to be, Stephen was talking about this and I'd be interested to hear his thoughts on the question, but I think it's a really difficult question, but I think we need to think really hard about it because we are entering a stage where the government might be able to track everyone all the time. And I don't think any of us want to live in a world where the government can track everyone all the time, because I think historically it has been shown that that hasn't been used just for figuring out who committed a crime or any of those things. But if we have a government that wants to track people down who are standing up for immigrants or any of those things, and they can track everywhere you're going, that becomes very dangerous very quickly. So, I don't know the answer to your question, and maybe you'll come up with the answer. I think it's a really hard balance, and it's always the question we have to ask when we're trying to figure out how much power the government gets, but also like what we want to keep to ourselves.
It's a great question. And to add on, I wonder if the question becomes easier to answer if this is the lawyer maneuver. I'm going to change the question. If it's a question of power, surveillance in my mind is power. And surveillance operates almost entirely outside of the law. And so is the question, do we give more do we give more power through surveillance to the government, to Peter Thiel? Like he's running, he knows probably more about my life than I know about my life. Or do we take the law? So like the Fourth Amendment, the example, the Fourth Amendment was intended to bring this practice of surveillance in a way into the law. And so if the question is like, instead of thinking about it as surveillance, safety versus security, or safety versus justice, think about it more in terms of power versus law. And do we take surveillance and bring it into the law and regulate it in a way so that you can achieve those objectives? Because right now it's just a force of power. And power, as David just explained, will just expand exponentially by whomever holds it.
Time for at least one more question. And I saw you earlier. So.
This is a question for David Morales. First of all, thank you for your work. So there's a local journalist, Danny Westneat, who had a column recently about farm workers and farmers. And so my question is, are farmers or restaurant owners or hospitality employers potential allies in this struggle? Because obviously, no workers, no farming. So your comment.
Yes, but there's a couple of trends that cut against it. So fundamentally, agriculture doesn't work without immigrants, and agriculture doesn't work without undocumented workers. Like, that's... And everyone knows that, but everyone has to sort of pretend they don't know that. And in the first Trump administration, there was a farm, Brochi, that was owned by a evangelical family that really thought that being good employers was part of their religious mission. And they spoke out quite forcefully against the first Trump administration. And then they got hit with a $3 million I-9 audit. Then that farm sold, and it got purchased by private equity. No one is going to do that again. Like, the message has been sent, you will be I-9 audited if you publicly question the administration. And to be I-9 audited could be deadly to most farm operations. And so they're in a really tough spot about these things. The other trend to think about is that the old Republican Party is kind of dying. And, Dan Newhouse, who's currently the like one of the last pro-immigrant Republicans, is retiring this year. And none of the people who are going to be running to replace him are running on a pro-immigrant wing within the Republican Party. Like, that version of a moderate pro-business, it's just gone. There isn't space to make those arguments right now politically. And I think it's very hard because I think Dan Newhouse you know, I didn't agree with all the things that he said or did, but this guy really worked hard trying to get immigration reform passed. And now there's going to be no Republicans with that kind of mentality or that kind of setup. So, in theory, yes, it fundamentally harms Yakima. It fundamentally harms the economy. It breaks society apart to enforce immigration in a community that is that undocumented. And there are many little towns that are about 50% undocumented, like the little farm worker towns like Mattawa and Mapton and Wapato and so forth. I just don't think that there's people who care anymore. And that's the really hard part. And the people who care are too afraid to speak up because of the way power works.
Can I say one more thing about that? I actually think there's, I think David is right that there were some businesses that wanted to do the right thing, but I think there's also some businesses that are very happy about what's happening right now. Farm workers were gaining a lot of rights through unbelievable advocacy. And this just changes the power dynamic completely. If you think that you can be deported with one call, you're certainly not going to be forming a union and asking for higher pay on that farm. And so while I think there are some businesses that it hurts, I think there are other businesses that it allows to take advantage of people. And if you look at where Big Ag put their money in 2024, which candidates they backed, it was Trump. They weren't worried that they would undermine their labor force. They thought he would make their labor force slaves, basically.
But I hate to end on that note.
Boy, that's a bummer.
But yeah, quick, think of some. But I will stall for inspiration and come back to the gratitude that I feel to all of you and also to all of you in the room, right? Because I know that the work that you've been sharing with us has really been tremendously inspiring for me to hear about tonight, but on the daily is hard and is arduous and is risky and keeps you up at night. And I'm just so grateful to what you're doing. And I'm so grateful to you for coming and sharing it with us tonight. And I'm grateful for all who are here and those who are on the live stream. And I hope that we all take this inspiration to heart, not only the inspiration, but also the sobering parts, right? Because I don't want to hear anybody else say, well, at least we're not Minnesota, you know. This is happening now, and there is nothing to be gained by saying we will stay silent to avoid Trump's roving eye. So I hope we all can take that to heart and take inspiration from your leadership. And I want, in closing, to thank our co-sponsors as well, the Department of Law, Societies, and Justice, the School of Law, and above all, to thank the phenomenal staff of the Center for Human Rights who make all of this happen. And the students who power our work, and all of you for being here tonight. So thank you.
Sorry, I really set you up.
Thank you, my friend.
That was really inspiring.